I'm George Galloway.
I'm Steve Topple.
And we are Topple Galloway. What's grabbed you this week, Steve?
What's grabbed me this week? Well, we had some huge revelations in the ongoing saga of the undercover policing inquiry, also known as the Spycops scandal. Yes, The Guardian basically published the list of all the organisations which had been targeted by undercover policing. Now, the list went from the Sublime, which was a community group in Leeds, was targeted when they set up their own little... A huge threat to the established order, where they set up a community group which was funded by a grant from the government. They were spied on by the Rozzers, to the ridiculous that's a huge list of people who infiltrated the wonderful Socialist Workers' Party.
I saw actually they had more infiltrators than anyone else.
Everyone's favourite political group, the SWP, the nonsense that they are, and they were heavily infiltrated. But I mean, some of the names on the list as well were sort of more telling. Obviously, the RNT had been heavily infiltrated, Fire Brigades Union, Unison, Unite, anti-fascist groups, animal liberation groups, Communist Party repeatedly came up. So it was kind of, for me, it was like, well, this is fascinating, and it is quite staggering, the amount of groups that were infiltrated, but it's not surprising. I mean, I've said to you before on this programme that my dad always used to tell me the story of these days in the Communist Party in the 50s, where they'd introduce, open their meetings, and they'd always say, and hello to our friends at the back, because they knew special branches were standing at the back, pretending to be members watching them. So it's not new, but the scale of it is quite extraordinary, and also, for me, what's more extraordinary is the way this inquiry has been conducted. We've never discussed this on this programme before, but I know people who have been witnesses in the Spycops inquiry, and there's been numerous staggering misdemeanours throughout the inquiry process. For example, one friend of mine, the person who the Spycops she was involved with, she didn't know obviously who it was, they published a name without even telling her, and so she had to find out through the press that someone she considered a friend for 5 years who she lived with was actually an undercover police officer, even though she'd given witness to the actual inquiry. And then someone else, their name, the name of a witness was released through a risk assessment and put into the public domain without their permission. The whole thing's been sort of mired by incompetence and what looks like willful neglect.
The proximate cause of this inquiry is the highly unethical practice of these Spycops of forming relationships with women, in some cases fathering children with women, when the entire thing was a lie, that the woman was a subject of their investigation. Now, if that's not unethical policing, I'm not sure what... I mean, they wrecked the lives of these women. They've damaged the lives of these children by appearing in their lives, fathering their children, walking away, and then the children now know that their father was actually a copper rather than a bearded progressive.
Yeah, it's absolutely, you're correct. That's the most sort of nauseating part, really, of this whole thing, that is the lengths they would go to, that they quite happily ruin people's lives. And I mean, I struggle to get my head around the sort of proportion of this, because some of the groups they infiltrated, I mean, they're no real threat. I mean, this is sort of...
Well, I mean, that's one of the main issues that arises. Who chooses the groups that are a threat to our way of life? What is our way of life? Who chooses which groups are a threat to it? And the devotion of public money to penetration, forgive the pun, and infiltration of these organizations. Some of them were kind of obvious, and I've always worked on the assumption that the state is listening, reading,
Good afternoon, GCHQ.
Send hello to our friends at the back, sending people into my circle. I mean, even when I ran for London Mayor, which was a small campaign, got 154,000 votes, but nothing remotely like enough. Ill-funded, very small group of activists. Even amongst them, I was looking around my own kitchen table, wondering who was there from the yard.
Yeah, of course.
Or worse than the yard. So, you know, I myself don't have a particular problem with it. My life is an open book. I don't do things of which I'd be ashamed. I sometimes do things of which I'd be embarrassed, but that's a different thing. But the devotion of significant public resources into a community organization in Leeds or a Friends of the Earth meeting in the Streatham Library, it's clearly disproportionate. And there are other issues arise. How many times did these police agents act as agents provocateurs? In other words, I'm a police agent, I'm encouraging you to break the law, to become more extreme. There's a logic in that because it keeps me in a job, keeps the expenses rolling in. The more I can encourage you to do dodgy things, the more need there is for me to keep spying on you. That's something that isn't being addressed in this inquiry.
Very good point,
Second point is, this is all so long ago. I mean, so long ago, I was still an activist in Scotland when most of this spying was going on. So, as I saw you raise on Twitter the other day, who are they infiltrating now?
Exactly. This is my major problem with this. And to be honest, it's my major problem with most bloody things that go on in society, and we hear about them historically after the event, because there seems to be this notion in the public psyche, or rather a notion is forced onto the public psyche, that, oh, well, this was historical. This happened many, many years ago, and we're expected to believe that these leopards changed their spots suddenly, and this kind of thing doesn't exist anymore, and it doesn't go on, which is, of course, absolute unfettered nonsense. And it must be. This is my major concern, that and some of the dates sort of go up to 2006, 2007. So what are they doing now? My logic would presume that the methods have changed, that they have no need to actually embed people in organisations now because of the rise of technology and social media, and of course the Investigatory Powers Act of 2016, where they basically legalised all the illegal stuff they were doing before that Snowden exposed, that they would be monitoring via technology. I mean, I've seen it myself. Whenever I go out with disabled people on a protest, for example, a couple of streets around the corner, you always see the green police van, which is the monitoring van, where they are monitoring what's going on social media, where they're monitoring telephone calls. There's always parked a few streets around the corner, but anyone who's anyone in the activist world. So it's
SIGINT rather than human.
Yes,
no.
And exactly. And it does beg the question, who are they now monitoring? Because I mean, it's no small stretch of the imagination for me that someone like yourself would obviously, I'd say, be monitored because of what you say and what you do. I think outlets like the Canary would probably, there'd be some sort of level of monitoring of them because of some of the work we've put out in the past. But also,
I hope they pay their subscription.
I hope they do. Yes,
I hope they're on the Patreon
exactly.
site too.
Just $1 a month for 4 episodes, GCHQ, if you'd like it. And I also believe they monitor in current times groups like Disabled People Against Cuts, who I support, because they are, I mean, they're quite a militant disabled people's organisation. They've caused problems in Parliament before. But it does beg the question, what the hell is going on now? What do we not know about? And I think in this age of the digital revolution and the internet, we should all be very worried about what they are doing.
By the way, it's a small segue, but did you see the report this week about the attitude towards black people in Britain by MI5 and MI6 in the 1960s? Did you see that?
No, I didn't.
There's a report, never before seen documents from the security services, in which they have an open discussion about why it wouldn't be wise to employ British black people in the service because they are likely to have a chip on their shoulder. They never ask why they might have a chip on their shoulder, but a chip on their shoulder which would make them unreliable as servants of the state, as men and women in raincoats. Now, you might put that down to, well, that was the 1960s after all. But it is still the case that neither MI5 or MI6 have a single person of colour from an ethnic minority in either of their upper reaches anywhere. They therefore must be the last two institutions in Britain that are all white affairs.
Here endeth the lesson. A leopard never changes its spots. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Is it going to be a boy? Is it going to be a girl? I think we can safely say it's a bloody parasite. This is the news that Meghan Markle... No, she's not even Meghan Markle anymore, is she, really? Meghan, whatever...
Duchess, isn't she?
The Duchess of wherever is having a baby with the Prince of someone.
Woman has baby shock.
Yes, woman has baby shocker. So Meghan and Harry are collectively with child, just a matter of weeks after they got married. If I had a shotgun, I'd have it to hand. And it couldn't be more perfect.
Oh, I never thought of that. Do you think that might be...
Well, I mean, it's all right. The timing is interesting, to say the least, because obviously they got married, and then spring baby is coming along. It's also perfect, isn't it? And
just in time for Brexit.
Just in time for Brexit.
A Brexit baby.
And they've been jetted off to Australia now, haven't they? Where republicanism is on the rise. Obviously to try and sort of quell the mass unrest with the royal family over there. Never mind.
You're such a cynic. Look, be happy. A young couple, very much in love. I think it's a breath of fresh air. We're going to see little...
Sorry, I was nodding off
mixed race. We're going to see
Carry on.
Little mixed race children running around on the royal balcony. If Prince Philip is still alive at the time, he'll probably die of shock. This is the first black person in the royal family.
Yeah.
First Roman Catholic in the royal family. She seems like such star quality. They're really lucky to have her. And she's turned out to be extraordinarily fertile. I mean, the door has just closed on the honeymoon suite and she's in the club.
Look, right, I'm deeply suspicious. Okay, Lily Allen has been accosted by the mainstream press, as it happens, for tweeting that coincidence, to distract us all from Brexit, there's a royal baby. And
I think they just had sex, actually.
What do you think? I'm not sure if a turkey baster may have been involved. But Lily Allen has been accused of being a conspiracy theorist.
I never thought of any of these things.
Do you sit...
I just assumed it was the natural consequence of their loving union.
Look, I was discussing this with my wonderful girlfriend, Nicola, this morning before I came to film this show. And Lily Allen has been accused of being a conspiracy theorist, saying that it was time to distract us from Brexit. She didn't really say that. She was just jokingly saying it, but she's been widely condemned. There seems to be something about royal children coming quickly after a wedding. It's almost as if, like, they're told, right, you now have to have sex.
One heir, one spare.
But I think surely they do, don't they? Surely they're instructed to, you now have to have a child.
These children, this child, I mean, she is 37, which in medical terms is a geriatric mother. That's literally what it's called on the file, yeah. So it is, you know, lucky that she got pregnant quite so quickly. And I hope that they managed to squeeze more in or squeeze more out before the end. But they'll be seventh in line for the throne. They won't be called prince or princess.
No.
Of course, it's another mouth to feed. But as Mrs. May said, austerity is over. We can afford it.
We can afford it, of course. But there's a serious point briefly with this as well. I'm anti-monarchist, not for the... No. Good grief.
That's a surprise.
You should have seen the discussion off camera about this as well. I am an anti-monarchist, not for the weak, flaccid arguments that a lot of Republicans make, which is all they cost us taxpayers' money, because that argument is so debatable, because the government finances show that because of tourism, they bring in lots of money. Blah, blah. That's a null and void argument. I'm anti-monarchist because they represent everything that's wrong with Britain in terms of the hierarchy that we live under, and the world, for that matter. This hierarchy that we live under, also that they involve themselves in politics when they're not supposed to, if you remember the Black Spider letters from Prince Charles. But ultimately, this royal baby On a serious note, I find it quite nauseating, not least because there was a report out yesterday which said that infant mortality numbers in this rate is now 4 in 1,000, where in the EU it's 2.8 in 1,000. That's around 40% higher infant mortality in this country than in the EU. And the report says that if we don't get it under control, it will be 140% higher by around 2030. We have a real issue in this country with poor children dying. And what we also have an issue with is, as I wrote about several months ago, that the birth rates for the richest in this country are now skyrocketing, while the birth rates for the poorest in society are actually dropping off. So this whole notion of benefit scrounging families having loads of children is essentially bollocks. And what we are seeing is a shift.
Well, there are family are benefit scroungers.
Well, they are benefit scroungers. But
we're just on queue at the DSS office.
Indeed. We are seeing a shift in this country of the richest cementing their hold in society by having more children, lower mortality rates for them, while the poorest in society, via things like the two-child limit on tax credits and mortality rates for children, are being stopped from reproducing. And there's a real issue, and for me, the word it represents is eugenics. That's what we're living under.
Eugenics, Eugenie. Eugenie was the least successful royal wedding in history. She married a tequila salesman. Harry has married a working actress of colour and, previously at least, of Roman Catholic faith. I think it's all breaking down. The country's going to the dogs.
And I think it's bollocks.
We now know that busfuls of Yemeni schoolchildren are not worth the hair on the head of a Washington Post columnist. The massacre of the innocents in Yemen has been now going on for 4 years. A Saudi Arabian-led coalition, they call it, though it wouldn't be able to lift a finger in the Yemen without the full participation of British and American military hardware and military officers. Yemen is now a disaster of biblical proportions. Not only have tens of thousands of people, mainly women and children, been wiped out by bombs and missiles, there's a cholera epidemic in the country, the worst in more than 200 years, and the UN has just declared that there's a famine in Yemen, which may be the worst famine in a century.
Yeah.
And I was, by the way, present at the last big famine in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, in sub-Saharan Africa in the mid-1980s. I know what a famine looks like and smells like. But that famine will be as nothing to the famine that is now underway in Yemen. We have struggled now all these years to get any Western journalist, with a few honourable exceptions, Orlager of the BBC.
It's very good, actually.
Very good. To get Western journalists interested, Western policymakers interested, and completely failed. And then along comes the mafia-style and gruesome hit on Jamal Khashoggi, the columnist of the Washington Post. Isn't it amazing when the rest of the world catches up with you?
It's kind of amazing and infuriating in equal measure. I have a vested interest in this because I was writing about Yemen before anyone else bothered picking up on it. I was at the middle of 2015. I started writing about what was going on in Yemen and started shouting about it. And as you say, slowly it kind of drips into the mainstream press. And now suddenly a Saudi Arabian journalist is murdered. Dismembered allegedly still, but of course it was an interrogation gone wrong, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, the killers just happened to bring a bone saw with them on their day trip.
I've got one in my back pockets now.
As you do. As you do. Club 1830. Bring your own bait.
We shouldn't laugh, but it's how ridiculous it is, isn't it? It's preposterous.
It's gruesome. I mean, even the mafia would have balked at this hit.
Yeah.
They lure the guy in for his divorce papers. They murder him, allegedly on tape, presumably because the Turks have bugged the embassy, as most countries bug most people's embassies, but maybe also because he had an Apple Watch.
Yeah,
Buy an Apple Watch, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be able to record your own demise.
It's just absolutely staggering.
And then they cut him into pieces and carried him out in cake boxes into a van, into a private jet, because these Saudis always travel in private jets,
Indeed.
and presumably disposal over the empty quarter somewhere. I mean, it is a heinous, almost unbelievable crime. And against someone who was, by the way, no progressive. This is a man, Khashoggi, who supported the Saudi war on Syria, which has dismembered, I don't know how many, hundreds of thousands of people, who supported for a time the Saudi war on Yemen, who supports, no longer, but supported the Saudi royal dictatorship system.
And until 2017.
And they still murdered him.
Yeah. I mean, these... Saudi Arabia are essentially maniacs. They are absolute maniacs.
The clue was in the public beheadings of people on Friday afternoons in public squares.
Exactly. It's the equivalent of us going to the cinema. I mean, they are absolute maniacs. But you're quite right to point out that suddenly now the interest has peaked in Yemen and Saudi Arabia's horrific, almost biblical style crimes that they commit. Suddenly everyone's going, oh, well, this isn't very good, is it? But I mean, let's put this into context. As you say, the Yemen war since 2015 has been going on. I hasten to call it a war, really. It's the same as calling what happens in Gaza a war. It's not. It's essentially a genocide, a paid-for genocide by Western governments.
It's Mike Tyson in the ring with a small baby.
Yeah. I mean, so UK governments so far running total 4.6 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia since this conflict began. 3/4 of the population, 21 million people in Yemen, are in need of humanitarian aid. As you say, UN are predicting the worst famine in 100 years, which could affect 13 million people. You've had estimates range from 7,700 people killed to anything upwards of 10,000 people killed. The figures are just staggering. And within all this, you have the UK's involvement, which is, for example, the UN last year pinned at least 500 deaths of children, specifically on Saudi airstrikes. These are planes sold to Saudi Arabia, I think, by the US, and the bombs are the ones we sell to them. As you quite rightly pointed out, you have UK military personnel stationed in Saudi operations centres directing all of this, and meanwhile, the UK government put Saudi Arabia on its 30 top countries for human rights abuses, and yet still doesn't blink an eyelid to sell them all these weapons and involve itself in this conflict.
Not just that, Steve, they kiss the nose as a prelude to kissing the posterior of these barbarians.
Yeah.
When this Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, came to Britain, then to New York, Washington, and Hollywood, he was described as a rock star prince. Yeah. His picture was everywhere. And not just in paid advertising, though it may have been paid under the counter, in editorial, from The Guardian to The Times, newspaper after newspaper, broadcaster after broadcaster, hailed this man as a rock star, as a reformer, as a man who was allowing Saudi women to drive, but only if there was a male relative in the car and they could afford to do so, of course. This man is a violent mafia-style thug. But all of our media class salivated over him.
Yep.
And why? Not because of the prophets, peace be upon them, but the prophets, how to get a piece of them.
Indeed.
Couldn't make it up. Just when you thought it was safe to get back in the water, just when you thought you'd tramped the dirt down, just when you thought that the iron sarcophagus in which she's interred had rid us of Margaret Thatcher forever, she's coming back on the £50 note, Steve. I mean, there's some benefit to her being on the £50 note because it means the Bullingdon Club will not be able to set fire to them and wave them under the noses of homeless people in shop doorways. And it means that only rich people will have to look at her.
Yes.
But it's a sick reflection on our society that this is now a serious runner that Margaret Thatcher, the most disastrous wrecker of social peace, social fabric, and industrial productivity and wealth in this country that there has ever been, should maybe be considered to appear on a banknote.
Yes, absolutely. I watched you on Good Morning Britain on Tuesday morning with
with Boris Johnson's father.
Yes. Oh, God,
a double act is born.
Good grief! Not better than this one, of course.
Topple Galloway,
Galloway. No, thank you. No, I thought you were marvellous, and you summed it up very nicely because. And the Piers Morgan shows a complete lack of understanding. It's what it represents, the fact that they would be willing to do this. I mean, you can stem nearly everything that's wrong with the world in some respects on a sort of basic level. You can stem it all back to her and Reagan and the
Reaganomics is still going on.
The Big Bang of 1986, the deindustrialization of the North, which still sees, I read some interesting figures the other day, between 2010 and 2016, growth in London was 22%. In the Northeast, it was just 4%. We are still seeing the effects of Thatcher's policies today. And to somehow have this woman honoured on a £50 note, which admittedly no one's going to have, it's a slap in the face to... I mean, it's hard to know where to begin with who it's a slap in the face to, really. Whether you want to say the miners, whether you want to say the northern communities, whether you want to say Irish, whether you want to say the council house tenants. It's staggering that they would consider this, but I think it embodies the arrogant emboldenedness as well of the establishment class at the minute, that they are literally, they're so dogmatic and so sure of themselves and the path that they're putting us on, that they would even consider suggesting that we can, because there's a petition launched, isn't there, as well, to get
it's Treasury inspired. I mean, they're flying the kite to see if it, that's why I'm reacting so fiercely to it. I think if the public respond negatively in enough force, we can ditch it. You might say, what a victory would that be?
But no, it matters. It does matter, I think.
I think it does. It's sending a signal from the state that she and all her evil works is somehow respectable. When I had thought, prior to her demise actually, incidentally, the £12 million house in which she died was registered in the Panama jungle. If there had been Panama Papers at the time, she'd have been on it. She was a tax dodger. She destroyed 30% of British manufacturing capacity. She destroyed the coal industry and the lives of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children who depended on it. She shut the steel industry, the shipbuilding industry, the car industry, the motorbike. I mean, she wrecked, she even stole milk from the hands of small school children. But here's a point. I spoke to one of the young women in the Good Morning Britain studio. She asked me what I was in to talk about. I said I was in to talk about Thatcher. And the young woman looked at me with a lack of recognition. Glazed eyes. Such is the parlous state of public education, public grasp of current events and how we got here. This young woman had never heard of Margaret Thatcher, still less that Thatcher was one of the most wicked people that ever held office in this country. And my goodness, that's stiff competition that she was in. So, you know, if you think about it, she left power 28, nearly 30 years ago. That means you need to be 45, actually, to remember just how awful she was. Unless, like us, we're not 45, but we read the history books.
We do. And that is it for this week's show. We just want to say again, thank you so much for all your comments. We love seeing them. It's always about our clothes, repeatedly, about slightly different shoes today.
Fantastic shoes.
Thank you.
I think that's your best hat. I mean, I really do think
you haven't seen the one I've got planned for next week. Good grief. But please keep your comments coming in, and our subscribers are on the up as well.
Yeah.
People are loving the Topple Galloway show. So make sure you subscribe to us on patreon.com/George Galloway. And until next week, please take care of yourselves. Just one more thing again. The saga with Universal Credit has been rolling on this week, with Esther McVeigh now coming out and admitting that the leaked comments in the Times saying many families would be £200 a month worse off are actually true. However, she then stood up in Parliament on Monday the 15th of October, and when asked by Debbie Abrahams about this, her response was, but more people are doing work. If they do more work, they'll be fine. This is the most ludicrous answer I've heard out of this woman's mouth yet, that by somehow cutting people's benefits, they're going to be protected because they're going to have to do more work. Now, we all know this was, of course, the point of Universal Credit, that it was to force millions of sick and disabled people and those who have limited capability of working back into work. However, the fact she admits that in Parliament is absolutely staggering. And suddenly, the mainstream press has caught up with the rest of us as well. They're now all over it. But this is not enough. We need to be campaigning on this issue. Universal Credit has to go. Stop, scrap, now.
Just one more thing. The state of the British Conservative Party. I've spent an unusual amount of time this week in the company of right-wing and establishment journalists who just a few weeks ago were saying that Theresa May, resilient Theresa May, would tough it out and see us through. Actually, at the very second that a rat's heart stops beating, all the parasites living on the rat depart from the corpse. That has begun to happen. And who do they think is going to be the next unelected Prime Minister of Britain? Jeremy Hunt. I'm not making that up. The man who made such a success of the National Health Service, who turned the entire medical profession from the Royal Colleges to the militants of Unison against him, he is going to be your next Prime Minister. Remember, you heard it here on Topple Galloway.